the family's 40th anniversary gala, in front of 150 guests, my mother-in-law clinked her glass and announced, "Before dinner, a small note: Ivy will be helping our staff serve tonight. She's so good at it." Some people are just born to serve, and some to be served. 150 people chuckled into their champagne. I was holding a tray. I set it down. And I said, "Actually, Catherine, before anyone has served anything, I think the room should know who owns the building we're standing in. Because it isn't you. It hasn't been for 2 years. Let me back up. My name is Ivy Calloway. I'm 34 years old. For 6 years, I married into a family so wealthy and so cold that they turned their own daughter-in-law into a servant at their parties and smiled while they did it. Never once suspected that the woman carrying their trays had quietly become the most powerful person in the family. The Vances were old money, real old money, the kind that owns the land the new money builds on. My husband, Thomas, was the youngest of 3, and the softest, which in the Vance family meant the least respected. His mother, Catherine Vance, ruled the family like a monarch ruling a small, cruel country. His father, Richard, was a genial ghost who'd handed Catherine the reins of the household decades ago and retreated into his study and his golf. His older siblings, Preston and Camille, were exactly what you'd expect: polished, entitled, and fluent in the family language, which was contempt delivered with a smile. I was a nurse when I met Thomas, not a Vance-appropriate profession. I met him when his father, Richard, was briefly hospitalized, and I was Richard's nurse, and Thomas came every day, and we fell into the easy, quiet love of 2 people who'd both spent their lives being the overlooked one in a loud room. Thomas was the overlooked Vance. I was the overlooked Calloway, raised by a single mother who cleaned houses, a fact Catherine would later weaponize with surgical precision. When Thomas told his family he was marrying a nurse whose mother cleaned houses, Catherine did not object. That's important. She did something colder than objecting. She smiled and she welcomed me, and then she spent 6 years making sure I understood, in 1,000 deniable ways, that I was staff who'd married in. Let me give you the first scene, because it set the pattern for everything. Our engagement dinner at the Vance estate. Catherine sat me not with the family, but near the end of the table and midway through the meal when the caterers were short-handed. She turned to me, warmly, so warmly, and said, "Ivy dear, you're used to being on your feet all day. Would you mind terribly helping bring out the next course? You'll be so much faster than the staff." And I, wanting to be liked, wanting to belong, said of course, and I got up from my own engagement dinner and served the family their food. And Catherine watched me do it with a small, satisfied smile, and I understood too late, tray in hand, that I had just been shown my place and that I had walked to it myself. That became the arrangement, not officially. Nothing in the Vance family was ever official. That was the genius of Catherine's cruelty. It was always a favor, always framed as my being helpful, always deniable. At every family gathering, and there were dozens, the Vances entertained constantly, there would come a moment when Catherine would find a reason for me to serve. "Ivy's so good with people. Ivy doesn't mind. Ivy, you're used to this sort of thing." And I would carry the trays and pour the wine and clear the plates while the family and their guests were served. And afterward, Catherine would thank me publicly for being such a help, which made it charity, which made me unable to object without looking ungrateful. Thomas hated it. I want to be fair to Thomas. He'd try to stop it, and Catherine would turn it around. "I'm only asking because Ivy offered, aren't I, Ivy?" And put me in the position of either contradicting her in front of everyone or going along. And I always went along, because I was raised by a woman who cleaned houses, and I'd learned young that making a scene costs the powerless more than the powerful. Thomas and I would fight about it in the car home, both of us miserable, both of us trapped in a dynamic his mother had spent decades perfecting. Here's the scene that changed me. Year 3. Charity gala at the estate. The Vances loved a charity gala, loved being seen as generous, exactly the way they loved being seen as gracious to the nurse they'd let marry in. My own mother was there. I'd been permitted to invite her, a rare concession. Midway through the evening, Catherine found her moment. She asked me in front of my mother to help serve, and I saw my mother's face. My mother, who had cleaned other people's houses for 30 years so I could become a nurse and marry a man in a suit, watched her daughter be sent to carry trays at her own in-laws party. And my mother said nothing, because my mother also knew what making a scene costs. But in the car afterward, my mother, who never criticized, who taught me to keep my head down and be grateful, said one sentence that rearranged my entire life. She said, "Ivy, I carried trays so you wouldn't have to. Don't you dare teach my granddaughter that this is what we are." I wasn't pregnant yet, but I heard her. And something in me that had been bending for 3 years finally set, like a bone healing at last into something that could bear weight. I didn't make a scene. I want to be clear about that, because the story people expect is that I stood up at the next dinner and refused. I didn't. Refusing was the powerless person's move, and it would have cost me and changed nothing. Instead, I did something Catherine would never see coming, because it required the one thing she was certain I didn't have: patience and a plan. Here's what Catherine didn't know about me. As a nurse, specifically, as a nurse who'd spent years in hospitals, I developed a very particular skill. I paid attention to the people everyone else ignored, and I understood that the person who manages the details quietly holds more power than the person who gives the speeches. I'd watched it in hospitals my whole career. The doctors gave the orders. The nurses knew what was actually happening to every patient on the floor. And when things went wrong, it was always the nurses' quiet, careful records that told the truth. Vance family, it turned out, had a floor that badly needed a nurse. Because Richard, the genial ghost, my father-in-law, the man I'd nursed back to health years before, was declining. Slowly, privately, in a way Catherine was working hard to hide from the family and from the world, because Catherine's power depended entirely on the Vance fortune. And the Vance fortune, I began to realize, was not what everyone assumed. I became close to Richard, genuinely. It was the only Vance besides Thomas who'd ever treated me as a person. Perhaps because I'd cared for him when he was frightened and vulnerable, and you don't forget the person who was kind to you then. As his health declined, and as Catherine grew more consumed with maintaining appearances, I became the person who spent real time with Richard. I'd sit with him in his study. And Richard, lonely and unwell and increasingly clear-eyed about the family he'd let Catherine run, began to talk to me. What Richard told me over those quiet afternoons was this. The Vance fortune was largely gone. Decades of Catherine's spending, the estate, the galas, the lifestyle, the performance of old money had hollowed it out. Richard had watched it happen and, in his passive way, let it. What remained of real value was the estate itself. The Vance mansion and grounds, the physical seat of the family's entire identity, the place where all the galas happened, the address that was the family's whole claim to status. And the estate was mortgaged, heavily, to cover Catherine's spending. Richard had been quietly borrowing against it for years. Then came the part that changed everything. 2 years before the anniversary gala, the estate's debt had come due in a way Richard couldn't cover, and the family had faced the unthinkable, losing the mansion. And Richard, too proud to let the family know how bad things were, too passive to confront Catherine, had come to the one person he trusted. Me. I had money. Not Vance money, but real money because I'd been a working nurse for 15 years. I'd invested carefully. I bought a small rental property early, and it had done well, and I lived far below my means, because I'd been raised by a woman who cleaned houses and understood the value of $1 in a way no Vance ever had. I wasn't wealthy like the Vances pretended to be, but I was solvent in a way they secretly weren't, and I had access to more. Richard came to me, privately, ashamed, and asked for help saving the estate. And I made a decision that Catherine's 6 years of trays had prepared me for perfectly. I said yes, but not as a gift. As a business arrangement, documented with a lawyer. I used my savings and a loan secured against my own assets to pay off the estate's crushing debt. And in exchange, the deed to the Vance estate, the mansion, the grounds, the whole seat of the family's identity was transferred to me. Legally. Properly. Recorded at the county. For 2 years, I owned the ground the Vances stood on, and none of them knew. Richard kept the secret because he was ashamed. I kept it because I was patient. And Catherine went right on sending me out with the trays, in a house that belonged to me, in front of guests who came to admire a fortune that had been saved by the nurse she treated as staff. I didn't do it for revenge. I need you to believe that, because it's true. I did it for Richard, who'd been kind to me, and for Thomas, who loved his broken family, and honestly for the strange principle of it. I couldn't stand to watch the mansion lost, even a mansion where I'd been humiliated 100 times. But I'd be lying if I said I didn't know, holding those trays for 2 more years, that I was holding something else too. And I'd be lying if I said I didn't know a day would come when Catherine would go too far, and I'd be ready. The anniversary gala was that day. Richard had passed 3 months before, quietly, with me holding his hand, the way I'd held so many hands in my career. And with him gone, Catherine was fully in her element, the widowed matriarch, the queen at last unchallenged. She threw the 40th anniversary gala partly as a memorial and mostly as a coronation of herself. 150 guests. The estate lit up like a jewel. And Catherine, riding high, decided to remind the nurse of her place one final time, in front of the largest audience she'd ever have. She clinked her glass. She made her little announcement. Before dinner, Ivy will be helping our staff serve tonight. She's so good at it. Some people are just born to serve, and some to be served. 150 people chuckled, and I set down my tray. Actually, Catherine, I said, and my voice, trained by 15 years of speaking calmly in rooms full of crisis, carried to every corner of that grand hall. Before anyone is served anything, I think the room should know who owns the building we're standing in. Because it isn't you, it hasn't been for 2 years. The chuckling stopped. 2 years ago, I said, this estate was weeks from foreclosure. Catherine had spent the Vance fortune down to almost nothing, and the mansion, this mansion that you've all come tonight to admire, was mortgaged past saving. Richard came to me, privately, ashamed, because he couldn't bear to tell his own family how bad it had gotten. And I paid it off, all of it, with my own money, the money of a working nurse whose mother cleaned houses. In exchange, the deed to this estate was transferred to me, legally. It's recorded at the county, any of you can check tomorrow. For 2 years, every gala you've attended here, every party where I carried your trays, you've been guests in my house. Catherine had gone the color of ash. That's a lie. Richard would never. Richard would, I said gently. And Richard did, and Richard left a letter saying so, witnessed by his attorney because he suspected you'd deny it. He was ashamed of what he'd let this family become, Catherine. He told me so, many times in the study in the afternoons. During all those hours you were too busy playing parties to sit with your dying husband. I sat with him, the nurse, the help. And he left this house to the one person in this family who was ever actually kind to him. The room was silent enough to hear the string quartet's bows go still. Preston stood up. You can't just, this is our family home. It's my home, I said. You're my guests. You have been for 2 years, and you've been perfectly happy to eat in it while treating the woman who saved it like staff. So here's what's going to happen. I'm not throwing anyone out tonight. I'm not that kind of person. I was raised better than this family. But the arrangement where I carry your trays is over, permanently. And the arrangement where this family pretends to a fortune it no longer has is over too, because everyone in this room now knows the truth. The Vance money is gone. It's been gone for years. The only thing holding up the name is a deed with my signature on it. Here's how it ended. Catherine tried, in the following weeks, everything a cornered monarch tries. She claimed I'd manipulated a dying, confused old man, and discovered Richard's letter and his attorney's testimony, and the fact that he'd been fully sound of mind defeated it completely. She tried to rally Preston and Camille to contest the transfer, and discovered there was nothing to contest, because it was a clean, documented, arm's-length transaction, structured by a lawyer specifically because I'd learned from 6 years of Vance games that everything must be on paper. She had no fortune left to fight me with, and that was the cruelest irony of all. Catherine had spent the family into a position where she couldn't even afford to sue the daughter-in-law she'd spent 6 years humiliating. The family fractured, as families like that do when the money that was holding them together turns out to be gone. Preston and Camille, it turned out, had been living on the assumption of an inheritance that no longer existed, and their contempt for me curdled fast into something closer to panic when they realized the nurse now held the only real asset the family had left. I felt, I'll admit, no obligation to soften that landing, but I didn't take the mansion from them out of spite either. That's not who my mother raised. I let Catherine live out her years in a wing of the estate, my estate, on my terms, on a budget, the way she'd once let me exist in her family on hers. The queen who'd sent me out with the trays lived out her days as a guest in the House of the Help, and if there's a cleaner justice than that, I've never seen it. Thomas and I had a daughter the following year. She'll grow up in that house, not as a Vance guest tolerated on sufferance, but as the child of the woman who actually owns it. My mother comes to stay whenever she likes, in the best guest room, and no one has ever once asked her to carry a tray. I made sure of that. It was, in a way, the whole point. Catherine spent 6 years teaching me that some people are born to serve and some to be served. She was right, in the end. She just had the two of us backwards.